This lecture is about the phenomena which exist in the universe. By phenomena, I mean anything that exists. And we want to get an understanding of how things exist and what they're made of and what is the nature of things that exist in the universe. I know that sounds like a very broad idea, like things that exist, but trust me, it's an interesting question when we think about the topic of how the phenomena which you observe in the universe emerge from smaller units and then the nature of that emergence. And so we start here, and what you're looking at is the standard model of particle physics. And as far as physicists can tell, these appear to be the smallest units of reality. There could be smaller units. For example, the idea of string in string theory posits that there are these tiny things called string, which are smaller than these particles and which vibrate in various ways to give us these particles, but that's never been confirmed. So, as far as we can tell, these particles are the smallest units of reality and they're indivisible. There's nothing smaller than them. And the standard model also tells us how these particles interact, namely via these gauge bosons in the light blue. These are the force carrying particles that mediate how these fundamental constituents interact. Now, you can take these fundamental constituents and arrange them in very interesting ways to give you new types of phenomena. So this right here is a proton, and it's composed of two of those up quarks and one of those down quarks. Through this very complicated mechanism by which they interact with each other, by which these constituents interact with each other, we get a stable structure known as a proton. Now, you can keep going. You can take several of these protons, as well as several neutrons, as well as some of those electrons that we saw in the standard model, and create what's known as an atom. Now, for a long time, we believed that these were the smallest units of reality, but it turned out that this is not the case. And you can create a whole variety of different atoms. This is the periodic table of elements, and it shows all of the various atoms that you could produce. You could also create isotopes of these atoms, which is when you have the same number of protons but a different number of neutrons. And you can just see how we can get a huge variety of different elements from the basic principle of combining protons and electrons and neutrons. And if you know anything about chemistry, you would know that each individual element here has different properties, and they can be grouped in various ways and classified in various ways based on their properties. And so just from these fundamental constituents, you're getting very complicated a huge variety of different of elements. And now you can actually take these elements, and the elements themselves can then become the units by which you build more complicated structures known as molecules. These are organic molecules, some of the simplest ones that that we know of. By organic, we mean composed of carbon and hydrogen. Now, carbon is a very versatile element because it can be used to create these long chains of hydrocarbons. And then you can imagine by taking various elements and making molecules out of them, you can get molecules with a huge range of different properties, and you can get very complicated molecules. Now, one of the most complicated molecules that we've ever observed is DNA. Now, DNA is special because it's not just this very complicated chemical structure. It's a chemical structure that's encoding information. It's encoding information about proteins, about these even more complicated biomolecules, which are made from amino acids. And these amino acids form these huge chains, and then these chains begin to fold in on each other into these complex structures. And these can be absolutely huge in molecular terms. But each protein can have different properties. And the main thing that proteins do are to act as enzymes. Enzymes are molecules that can catalyze chemical reactions. So they can speed up chemical reactions, and they can even be used to like synthesize other molecules. And so lots of proteins synthesizing lots of complicated molecules is a process that can lead to the creation of a cell. This is a simple animal cell, and you can see it has various components, but all of these components working together will give you a cell. It gives you a living organism. And so we're scaling up the complexity by quite a bit just at this level alone, because you can see how all of these components, each of these components in the cell plays a different function, and all of them working together gives you a living cell. Some of these components are engaged in producing energy, some are engaged in reproduction and maintaining the kind of integrity of the cell by, for example, the cell membrane. But all of these molecules are working together, and What's interesting is that we started out with a whole bunch of inert matter, so non-living matter, but if you combine it in the right way, you get something that's living, that's alive. And so something new has emerged, and you can keep going. You can keep using the structure that we've created as a kind of subunit for more complicated structures. So here we have some simple multicellular organisms that are composed of several hundred cells, but you can see how cells themselves can now be a unit to create a more complicated kind of structure in the form of these multicellular organisms. And then you can see, for example, here, how those cells can specialize to become very specific structures. And now each cell is playing a different role within the totality of the organism to give you an organism that's capable of a lot more and which has these specific structures, and various parts of its body perform various functions. And you keep scaling up, and you can get the massive variety of life that exists on this planet, the whole range of different plants and animals that are adapted to different environments, and are different, play different roles in the ecosystem and have different behavior, some of which is very complicated and some of which is rather perplexing and rather different from each other. So each species of animal and each species of plant can be so radically different from every other species of animal, and so you're getting all of this emergent complexity. And again, remember, think back to that very first slide. All of this appears to be arising from those very fundamental building blocks. So you're getting a huge variety of different types of living organisms. And at the bottom level, you just kind of have a few building blocks. And that's what we mean by emergence, that these things emerge from particles at the smallest scale. But then you can keep going with this principle. You can take several organisms. For example, you can take several humans and create something called a society. And so an entire society or an entire nation or city or community or even tribe or village begins to act as a kind of unit composed of these smaller units known as humans. And so humans themselves can work together in a cooperative manner to create something like a society. But then there's also examples of emergence which happen at different scales. So not just at the scale of society, but for example, at the scale of our nervous system. And something like our nervous system and the huge number of connections in our nervous system and in our brains, and the wiring and the different senses and different neurotransmitters. It's very complicated to describe all of this, but hopefully you're getting the idea. All of this emerges to give us our consciousness, our mental experience, our perceptions, the fact that we can think, the fact that we can imagine and have an internal experience. So consciousness itself is arising from the collection of a huge number of cells. And so you can see how there are different kind of classes of emergent phenomena. There are the mental phenomena, but then as well as like the structure of the human body as a kind of emergent phenomena. But within that structure and within the neurology of that, you get other emergent phenomena such as mentality, such as consciousness and qualia and all sorts of mental experience. But then we want to think about what other kind of phenomena exist in the universe. I want to think about the example of economics. What kind of a thing is economics? Because it involves the flow of money, and the reason money moves the way it does is because humans value it. So a subjective kind of human condition being imposed upon this thing called money is causing it to behave in a certain way and causes humans to treat it in a certain way. And we want to ask, what kind of a phenomenon is economics? Is it a kind of phenomenon which arises from those fundamental particles the way other things do? And what kind of domain does it occupy? And what about something like language? What kind of a thing is language? You've been listening to me talk this whole time, and you've been understanding these words, and that in of itself is such a profound fact that I can kind of make noise. I can vibrate the air in front of me, and it produces understanding in your head. But if I speak in another language, zum Beispiel wenn ich Deutsch spreche, you don't understand what I'm saying unless you speak German. And so what kind of a thing is language? Is language itself emergent? And what kind of domain of existence does it occupy? And what about something like science? Now, science is how we know about the world and how we were able to figure out all of the facts which I just told you. But science is also a thing that humans engage in. It's an activity that we do using scientific principles. So what kind of a thing is science, and where does it exist in the universe, in the domains of existence within the universe? And what about something like our technology? Like the computer that you're using to watch this is this perplexing, unprecedented phenomena which exists in our universe, which humans have envisioned and created. And to a large extent, humans don't really understand computers. Individual humans understand various aspects of computers. Like one guy might understand routers, one guy might understand coding, but it's very hard to find a person who understands all of this at all levels because it's such a complicated device. So what kind of a being is a computer, or really any technology that we created? Because these are things which were conceptualized in our minds, and then we create them in real life, and now they have these new properties. And so what are these kind of phenomena? And this is the question that we're going to be wanting to answer and to think about. Now, as you saw, you can create a kind of chain from the smallest level of fundamental physics all the way up to these higher levels, and you can see how that chain progresses from simple particles to atoms to molecules to living systems, and so you can see how you can start from the bottom level and work your way up. Now, the question we want to ask is fundamental physics all you need? In other words, to understand the behavior of these higher level systems, is it sufficient to simply understand the mechanisms which govern the very smallest parts? And if you had a big enough computer that could compute the behavior of every single individual particle, say in a human, or say in a society of humans, or even a plant, would that tell you how that system is going to behave? Could you predict human behavior just from what's going to happen with the fundamental particles? Now, the idea that you can actually do this is the idea of physicalism or physical reductionism, i.e. that every phenomenon can be reduced to fundamental physics. So this position is essentially saying that there's nothing other than physics. The universe is creating all of these crazy things, and they're very complicated and very structured, but at bottom, it really is just fundamental physics and nothing else. There is nothing else going on there. And when we create theories, like theories in biology to explain the behavior of living systems, or like sociology or linguistics or economics, all of these theories that we create are really just simplifications to help us understand phenomena. But in reality, all you need is physics. So we create these new fields of knowledge to help us understand very complicated dynamics. But that's only because the physics is so complicated. That it's pointless to try and use physics to understand economics. It's better just to understand economics and create its own theory. But you have to keep in mind that at the bottom level, there is nothing but physics. Like if you could do physics for every molecule that's involved with economics, you could do economics from the physics perspective. It's just very inefficient to do so. So that's the idea of physicalism. And attached to this idea is that all of these phenomena which exist at higher levels are weakly emergent. Okay, the idea of weak emergence is that is exactly what I just said. Is that these phenomena appear very interesting and complicated and sophisticated, but at the lowest level, all of this is being mediated by fundamental physics, and there's nothing else but fundamental physics. And so these phenomena are said to be weakly emergent because they arise from fundamental physics and are entirely governed by fundamental physics. That's what it means to be weakly emergent. Even your own behavior as a human being is really just these fundamental particles of which you are composed interacting via these gauge bosons. And that's you can calculate this. So this is the standard model Lagrangian, the short version, and it basically tells us how every particle interacts with every other particle. Excuse me, and it tells you the momentum and velocity of every particle. And so if you just plug in that information into this equation, you'll know how every single particle in the universe will eventually behave. And that is sufficient for telling you how everything in the universe will behave. And again, this is the idea of physical reductionism and weak emergence. Now, what I want to argue, and so this is the kind of point that I'm trying to make, is that this is actually false. that physical reductionism is false for certain systems. And so I'm arguing that even in principle, you cannot predict certain systems entirely from lower level laws. If you try to use the lower level laws, it's not a matter of computational inefficiency. It's you will literally get the wrong answers. It's not the fundamental physics is not accounting for certain phenomena which exist at higher levels and are genuine phenomena. Now, such systems that where it's impossible in principle and possible also in practice to predict what's going to happen just from the lower level is considered strongly emergent. So that's what strong emergence is. And there's a big debate about whether strong emergence exists, the distinction between weak emergence and strong emergence. And whether that's a meaningful category. And a lot of physicists are convinced that strong emergence doesn't exist and that everything can reduce to physics. But in this video, I'm making the case that actually a lot of phenomena appear to be strongly emergent. There's a whole host of implications that are tied to this and which make the concept of strong emergence really profound and really mind-opening. And it hopefully this lecture and what I'm going to say will cause you to see the universe completely differently. Now, generally, a phenomenon is strongly emergent if it occupies its own domain of knowledge, i.e., it involves new concepts which don't appear at the lower level. Okay, so when we talk about things like what happens in biology and like what a living organism does, for example, like a living organism strives to survive. So living organisms are driven by purpose, the purpose to survive, right? Now, the idea of purpose, do you think that applies to individual particles? So, I mean, it's hard to say that an electron has a purpose, like its purpose is to survive. Like, it just kind of is this inert piece of matter. And yet, this living system, which is composed of electrons and other particles, appears to have purpose. So something that applies to a collection of particles doesn't apply to its constituent parts. Now, again, what one might argue is that these concepts, for example, the concept of purpose or the concept of evolution by natural selection, or any other purpose or any other concept that exists in the domain of biology, which doesn't appear to exist in the domain of physics, is it possible that these concepts are just ways for our minds to kind of simplify things, to put things into categories to make it more approachable for us, for our minds? Because if we approached a biology from the physics perspective, our calculations would just become monstrous and enormous, and we would require like a huge computer and huge computing power to be able to do the math which governs a living system. So maybe these concepts are just a way for us to simplify things. Now, anytime this appears to be true, we can say that the phenomenon is weakly emergent with respect to fundamental physics. But in cases of strong emergence, this is not possible. Okay, and the reason this is not possible, and the reason why it's in principle impossible to derive a strongly emergent phenomenon from fundamental physics, is because at a higher level, there's a new phenomenon taking place. And that new phenomenon can be shown to have a downward causal effect upon the lower level laws. Okay? So some phenomenon that exists at a higher level is affecting things at a lower level. So originally we thought of emergence as being upward causation. So like smaller things give rise to bigger things. But what's happening with strong emergence is that those bigger things are now affecting the smaller things. And whenever this happens, there's no way to use the lower level laws to derive that higher level phenomenon, because the lower level laws themselves have been shifted or altered in this context. Okay, so we can look at this diagram to get a better understanding of what we mean by these different domains of knowledge. You can imagine at the beginning of the universe, all that existed was matter. But as the universe progressed, we had things like life emerge. And from life, we had mind, consciousness, mentality, sentience. And from minds and from the collection of minds, we have things like culture, and along with that, things like language and economics. Okay, now each of these phenomena exists at an emergent level at a different domain relative to the lower levels. Okay, and there are theories in these domains which really only apply to these domains. Okay. But not only that, these domains can interact with each other. So obviously all of our collective minds can influence culture, but culture can also influence our minds. Okay. So we're having different levels of existence interact with each other, and things which exist at a higher level can influence the constituents of which they're composed. Okay, so if the constituents themselves are being influenced by these higher levels, it makes no sense to simply use the lower level to derive the higher level, because the lower level is itself being changed by the higher level. So in order to understand these systems, you need to understand both the upwards effects as well as the downwards effects. So bottom up causation as well as top down causation. Now, one of the classic examples of strong emergence, which appears to be a case of very strong emergence, which is very convincing, is that of sentience, is that of consciousness and perceptions and mental phenomena, and any kind of qualia that you experience, like the color red or like the feeling of pain. These appear to exist on a level which is far removed from fundamental physics. Now, these phenomena likely emerge from physics and from physical mechanisms and things taking place inside your brain, but these interactions are so complicated and involve so many moving parts that they give rise to this kind of new phenomena, which exists in a space independent from matter. So I don't want to say that it isn't connected to matter, that these phenomena are disconnected from matter, but they depend on matter. But once they start to exist, they kind of live in their own domain and occupy a different level of reality, which can't just be reduced to matter. Another way of putting this is that you should think of your brain. So your brain is right now responsible for generating a huge percentage of your conscious experience. And you should think of your brain and the whole thing as a kind of holistic system. It's not just the sum of its parts. Your brain working together in this very complicated way should be thought of as a kind of new entity, giving rise to a thing called your consciousness. Which exists on a level that's independent from matter. And it's hard to even explain how matter can give rise to mind. And even there, you can start to see why something like consciousness, why something like sentience is irreducible. You can even slightly start, you can start to imagine how something like your consciousness has a downward causal effect upon matter. So like your consciousness, and human consciousness in general is what allowed us to understand particles and to understand that we're made of particles, okay? And so with our understanding of particles, we can start to manipulate them. We can create something like a particle accelerator to study particles. Okay, so our consciousness is having an effect upon the way particles interact. Particle accelerators don't just, spawn into existence. Like the reason particle accelerators exist is because humans invented them using our minds. And so our minds are having an effect on the way particles behave. And you can't just explain that by looking at the particles themselves. The particles themselves are kind of irrelevant at this scale. They're not entirely irrelevant, to be sure, but we can create entire theories of psychology which don't really involve particles and which don't need to account for particles in order to make sense of these phenomena. Now, if we get to the phenomenon of economics, we have something similar because a physicist might think that I could look at money and I know the chemical structure of money, or I could in theory, and then that could tell me how money moves. But this is false, because the way money moves isn't determined by the chemical composition of dollar bills. It's determined by the fact that human subjective consciousness has placed, mental value, subjective value, which exists entirely in our heads, and it exists collectively within our heads. We all value money, and that's the reason why money is valuable. So the movement of money isn't being determined by physics, it's being determined by subjective value. And subjective value is something that's non-physical. Again, you could say that subjective value arises from physics, and that's pretty clear, but then it starts to occupy a different domain. So it's a different kind of phenomenon. Mental concepts and mentality and something like value is a different concept and occupies a different domain relative to just physics. So it's not physics anymore. And same thing with economics. Economics is not physics anymore. It can't be reduced to physics. It occupies a completely different domain of existence. And so As a phenomenon, it can't be reduced to physics, and it doesn't even make sense to reduce it to physics because the movement of money is dependent on value and the feeling of value and the sense that humans have value for these things. That's what causes money to move the way it does. Now, DNA is a very interesting example. Now, you might be thinking like, well, okay, this is clearly a case where we can reduce things to physics because this is, these are particles, and obviously the way they interact is based on physics at the bottom level. And that's all true, but there are also reasons to consider what DNA does as being strongly emergent, okay? In other words, they can't be reduced to physics because what is DNA doing? DNA is encoding information, okay? It's encoding information about the structure of a living organism. So the DNA in your body tells your body what the kind of format and structure of your body is going to look like. Okay, so that kind of encoding isn't, it isn't just it isn't a physics concept. I can't just take just pure electrons and encode information with them. Well, I mean, you could, but even then, you would be manipulating them using your consciousness or using technology. But the idea of encoding like different proteins is not something that matter ordinarily does. It seems to be something that emerges when matter is arranged in a particular way and has new properties. And so what I'm claiming is that the property of encoding information about the structure of proteins is something new. It's not something that's reducible to physics. It's a brand new phenomenon which causes DNA to have properties which can't be reduced to physics. And that's pretty clear. DNA is a remarkable thing that exists in this universe. And to think that it's just reducible, I mean, obviously certain aspects of what DNA does can be explained by physics, but a lot of what's happening occupies a different domain relative to physics. For example, DNA evolves. It evolves through natural selection, and that's simultaneously a random and a directed process. It's directed by the environment. So the environment selects DNA, and even that you can argue is a top-down process because the environment is a collection of particles, which holistically, as a whole, can influence the structure of DNA. So it's being influenced by downward effects. But even apart from that, DNA is being directed by a very deliberate process, which is natural selection, but also a random process when you have random mutations. And so the combination of these random and deterministic factors means that you can't use physics to predict how DNA will evolve over time. Because there's going to be random things that happen, and physics, the standard model Lagrangian, which is a deterministic equation, won't tell you about that, what's going to happen randomly, but it's also not going to tell you how the environment will cause certain DNA to survive and other DNA to not survive. And so the process of evolution by natural selection is a concept which exists in biology, which affects DNA, but it can't be reduced to physics. It doesn't make sense as a fundamental physics concept. It exists in a different domain, which is why we need to create a theory of evolution by natural selection. That theory of the theory of evolution exists on the level of biology, and it can only exist on the level of biology. It can't be reduced to physics, and not only that, it's a real concept. It's not just a mental abstraction that we've created to explain very complicated physics. It in and of itself is a real concept and has a real effect upon the universe. So these phenomena that I'm talking about, things like economics, things like evolution, they're real. They really exist, and they're not just placeholders for complicated physics. And in fact, physics doesn't appear to play a role in something like evolution, apart from mediating the particle structure of DNA. But that's it. That's all it does. Natural selection itself is a different kind of process that isn't reducible to physics. Now, I want to make another point about why DNA is strongly emergent, and it has to do with the fact that DNA encodes information. Because you might be thinking that the structure of DNA is still determined by physical mechanisms. But what does DNA ultimately do? Ultimately, it survives, right? Like it perpetuates itself, and it survives through a process of natural selection. So it somehow maintains itself. It maintains its own structure. Okay. Now the thing is is that when DNA duplicates, it creates an identical, or not always an identical, but ideally an identical copy of itself. Okay. Now, if DNA duplicates, what you'll have are two identical strands of DNA. Okay. Now, those two strands of DNA are composed of completely different molecules. So at the molecular level, they're distinct, but at the coding level, they're exactly the same. They contain the exact same information with respect to what they encode in terms of encoding proteins which give rise to biological organisms. So the code is the same between both of them, even though the molecules are different. Okay, so what this shows is that the encoding itself must exist on a level beyond physics, because we have different molecules expressing the exact same information. And so that information must exist on a realm apart from the physics. It should be possible to express that information in different ways using different molecules, but that in and of itself shows that the coding, though being mediated by molecules, is something apart from the molecules. And you can think about it like this, like when the gamete that was fertilized by a sperm egg, which gave rise to you, when it was originally fertilized, it had a complete set of DNA. So all of the DNA that you're made out of was originally inside a fertilized egg cell. Okay. Now, where did that DNA go by the time you pass on your DNA to your children? Where did that DNA go? Well, that specific molecule may have been destroyed. It may be completely gone, or it may have been metabolized and is now a component of other DNA, or it may have been completely removed from your body and is just gone now. Okay, so the individual molecules are gone, and yet the information which they encoded can be passed on. And so the information itself has to exist in a domain apart from physics. It has to be something apart from the physics because the information survives, whereas the individual molecules which compose that information, they may have been long gone by the time you pass on your genes. So hopefully that demonstrates that DNA encoding information is irreducible to physics. It's not possible to reduce it to physics because what it's encoding is possible. It's possible to express that in various different formats with different molecules, and so the code itself must be something separate from the molecules. Even though the molecules are facilitating that, they themselves are not the code. The code is something beyond the molecules. So I want to say some stuff which George Ellis put in his 2020 paper. Now, when a strongly emergent phenomenon comes into existence, its evolution from that point on, so this from the moment that new property begins to exist, its evolution in time will not be predictable from lower level laws, because new higher level laws apply to the way it behaves, and these do not make sense at a lower level. Okay? So again, this might be something like economics, where you might think you can try to use physics to understand economics, but when something like economics starts to exist, there's new laws that apply to the way money moves. For example, the idea of supply and demand. Like, what is demand? Does demand make sense in physics terms? Like, no, it makes sense in economics terms. And so something that occurs at the level of economics is going to dictate the way money moves. And now whatever fundamental law of physics you may have tried to use to understand the way money moves will just no longer apply, because the way money is moving is now being affected by things that exist at a higher level. And so you can even think of that as like, the collection of molecules that comprises my brain should be thought of as a kind of new entity, and that new entity will now affect the phenomenon of physics, of economics. And so, reducing things and kind of just pure reductionism, it's what we're showing is that it doesn't really make sense to reduce everything to physics, and that these new phenomena which exist at higher levels are genuine phenomena. They're not just physics, but really complicated. These are brand new things that are taking place in the universe, and this is starting to explain why the universe presents us with so many different types of phenomena, which are just mind-bogglingly different from each other, and why the universe is so complicated and complex. we keep trying to simplify the universe to physics and act like there's a theory of everything. But what this is showing is that there cannot be a theory of everything, because new things keep existing in the universe, and they have new properties, which means that we can't apply a general theory to explain the way they behave. We need new theories every time something like this emerges. That's why we have chemistry. That's why we have biology, sociology, linguistics, economics, computer science. We needed a brand new branch of science to explain computers, because the way they behave is so strongly emergent that we needed new concepts to explain what's going on. But I'm going to read this quote by George Ellis, who's one scientist who's made contributions to the field, or to the idea of strong emergence. We can say that a high-level phenomenon is strongly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomenon are not deducible, even in principle, from truths in the low-level domain. In strong emergence, properties are only deducible from lower-level properties when you add concepts or variables that are derived from our knowledge of the nature of the higher-level emergent domain. The lower level simply does not by itself imply the relevant higher level concepts or variables. One needs empirical input from the higher level theory to determine such bridge laws. So again, what this is essentially saying is that new phenomena, which are composite from smaller phenomena, begin to have an effect on the smaller phenomena. Okay, so like it's any kind of object can't be simply thought of as a collection of particles, because that object, that collection of particles, holistically, as a whole, with all of its parts, might have new properties. And these new properties can actually affect the components out of which they are made. So you can't use the components to kind of give you those higher level properties. All you can do is observe those properties in nature, and then once you observe them, you can kind of create a new theory to explain the composite object. But again, you can't start from the lowest level to give you that higher level concept. We talked about this a little bit in the concept of biology, in the context of biology, but I really want to explain how something like evolution by natural selection, like this, that's not a physics term. That only applies to living organisms. And so the stunning diversity of living organisms that we can observe in nature, which includes yourself and all of your ancestors and all of the different paths which evolution has attempted to traverse, all of these can't be explained in terms of physics, but they can be explained in terms of something like evolution by natural selection, which is not a physics concept. It's a new kind of phenomenon which is occurring at a higher level. And so things like reproduction and like survival and the things that organisms, the kind of structures and behaviors organisms evolve in order to survive. The idea of survival itself is not a physics concept, and it doesn't make sense in terms of physics. It makes sense in terms of biology, because biology concerns entities for which the concept of survival applies. It doesn't apply to individual particles, but if you take all of those particles and arrange it, you get this kind of new entity, for example, a frog, and now new concepts now apply to this entity, which don't apply to its composite parts. The idea of survival, the idea of reproduction. Like again, physics doesn't concern reproduction in the sense of biology, but living organisms do engage in reproduction. And again, that's a new kind of phenomenon which exists in the universe. It didn't exist in the universe before life, but once life starts to exist, and once life emerges from molecules, new kind of things begin to apply to life, which don't apply to those individual molecules. Things like predation, the fact that living organisms prey on other living organisms, and that there's a survival of the fittest, and that things like metabolism, and the fact that living organisms reduce their own entropy. That's actually an interesting example. Let's think about that a little bit, because one of the laws of physics in the universe, or like one of the universal laws of physics, that's the right way to put it, is the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases. If you're not familiar with entropy, all this basically means is that things tend towards disorder. Things tend towards chaos. But living organisms are this brand new thing which seem to defy that because they don't tend towards chaos, they tend towards structure. It's only after you die, i.e. when you're no longer living, that your body begins to enter a state of chaos and it decays, right? But until you die, your body is sustaining itself and it's resisting entropy. And so in a sense, your body and biology is defying the laws of physics. It's not defying them totally because the laws of physics are still universally true, but in the context of life, in this particular context, the laws of physics are being broken. And that's kind of what we mean by these higher level concepts are having an effect upon lower level laws, because the lower level laws appear to be altered in these new contexts. So in the context of biology, the law of the second law of thermodynamics doesn't appear to apply as rigidly as it does for individual particles. What else do we have? Yeah, so like cellular reproduction, again, another concept which makes sense in terms of biology, and you can understand it from the context of biology, but it doesn't have any equivalent in physics. And I just want to really hammer home the point of what this implies, because if you look at life, and I always encourage people to just go outside and stare at insects and look at plants and just see and just think, what is this? What is this thing that exists and appears to be autonomous and is capable of moving itself? That's not merely physics. That's not merely particles moving. It's something else. Something else has arisen from this collection of particles, and it's engaging in this crazy, mind-boggling behavior. And because of that, life can take on so many different types of forms, and can be so diverse. And can have, even different organisms can have different properties, unique, completely different properties from other organisms, because they're giving rise to newly emergent phenomena. And so one example of a living organism might have one strongly emergent phenomena, but then a completely different branch of life may involve different strongly emergent phenomena. All of this is to say that this is really complicated, and I think one of the reasons people resist this idea is because it makes the universe more complex. And it proves that the universe is actually way more complex than we attempt to reduce it to. So we attempt to reduce it to a simple theory, but it turns out we can't create any simple theory that explains everything. The universe just keeps creating new things which defy the laws at the lower levels. And life is a great example of that, because just look how complicated life is and how perplexing it is. And all of this should point to the fact that there's no way to reduce life to physics. Life is something else, and it's doing something else, and it's engaged in a completely parallel process to the fundamental physics which facilitates it. Again, fundamental physics is not irrelevant. It facilitates all of this, but then life starts to do things which have nothing to do with physics per se. Physics only plays a facilitatory role in all of this. So yeah, what else we have? We can even talk about things that humans do and how it doesn't really make sense to talk of human behavior in terms of physics. For example, human creativity. Creating a statue or creating music, these things, in what sense does it make sense to explain the behavior of a drummer or of a person who's carving a statue in terms of physics? It doesn't really make sense, right? You can explain it in terms of culture, in terms of things which exist at the human level, but in terms of physics, it just becomes irrelevant. The physics is only allowing a human to exist as a physical structure, but the totality of what a human being is a composite object which in and of itself does things which are contrary to physics. Creativity being a great example, or falling in love and the experience of love. That's a powerful emotion. It's an emotional experience. It's a subjective experience, and that's what's causing us to behave in a certain way when we seek a partner or engage in romantic relationships. Again, it involves things which are not related to physics, or which emerge from physics, but which have properties that are not reducible to pure physics. Love being a great example, because love is this powerful emotional experience which exists subjectively, and yet that subjective quality, that thing that exists in our minds, which again is non-physical, is causing us to behave in a certain way. So a non-physical thing is having a causally efficacious effect upon the universe. So it has to be real. Emotions emotions have to be real, and they're not just physics, and then emotions are just this kind of epiphenomena. The phenomena itself is having an effect upon the world. And again, it's this holistic entity which emerges from physics, which is having the effect, and the individual particles are actually irrelevant at that scale. And consciousness, again, is a great example of all this, because anything which you experience through your consciousness, and I mean by that anything, sentience, anything that involves your sentience, and the qualia that you experience, the physical sensations that you experience, all of these are non-physical, and yet they must have a causal effect upon the world. Your thoughts about something will cause you to behave differently. Your moral beliefs aren't physical, like they exist inside your mind, and they exist in a kind of abstract space, and yet they can cause you to behave differently. Your moral beliefs may cause you to not steal or not kill. And so a non-physical thing is having an effect upon the world. And so again, this shows that to try and reduce everything to physics doesn't really make sense, and that emergent phenomena occupy genuine domains of reality, and have laws and properties which make sense at those levels, but which don't make sense at lower levels. Now, we can kind of sketch what this all looks like through this diagram. So we can think of causality as being, for the most part, horizontal. So all causality is horizontal. But lower level phenomena at a certain domain can, through emergence, give rise to higher level domains. So a higher domain phenomenon can arise from a lower level domain. And that's pretty simple, right? Like the fact that atoms can arise from quarks, or from atoms can arise from protons and neutrons. That's an example of a bigger phenomenon arising from smaller phenomena. But what's less obvious is the fact that this higher level domain, or this higher level phenomenon, can actually affect the lower level phenomena. So what this implies is, if we stick with that example of the particles of the atom arising from protons and neutrons, an atom itself, as weird as it sounds, an atom itself can have an effect, if it's strongly emergent, which it might not be, can have an effect upon the particles of which it's composed. Now that's kind of crazy if you think about it. The composite object, which is the atom, can affect its constituents. Like it's kind of hard to conceptualize, and yet we know many cases where this is the case. And I'll go through some examples. But generally speaking, again, causality is always going in this one direction. But through emergence, new phenomena can exist at a higher level and then exert a downward causal influence upon lower level phenomenon, while causality is moving in the same way. So again, this is another reason why we should be skeptical of reductionism, because in reductionism, there's no such thing as downward causation. There's only upward causation, or upward emergence. So things can only, smaller things can give rise to higher things, but those higher things do not in and of themselves compose new entities. They are reducible to the lowest level. But this, hopefully I've been showing that this is not the case, or arguing that this is not the case. And a great example of this, and again, I'll make one thing clear here, is that there can be a lot of different domains, like a lot. In fact, it's hard to even classify what counts as a higher domain relative to a smaller domain. There are mathematical ways to do this, for example, through something called symmetry breaking. There's also like kind of general heuristic ideas. So again, if something is composed of smaller things, you can think of that as being a higher level domain relative to the smaller things. So that kind of gives you a sense of what a higher domain is. But higher level strongly emergent phenomena can give rise to even higher domains of existence. So let's look at one example. So at the lowest level here, and again, these are kind of arbitrary because we can create a whole bunch of levels in between DNA and a person. But in this diagram, the lowest level is DNA. So DNA can give rise to a person. Your DNA is a molecule, and through that molecule doing what it does, it can give rise to a person. And many of that person's traits will have been determined by their DNA. So for example, this girl has blue eyes. That was determined by her DNA. So that's upward causation. So the DNA at the lower level gave rise to a phenomenon at the higher level, i.e. her eye color. Okay, that's simple enough. But then this person can become a unit in a bigger phenomenon known as a society. So this person is a member of their society, and a society is composed of all of its individual members. So all of these people are necessary for the society to exist. Okay. Now, what we can show, and it's very simple, and it's very obvious that this is the case, is that something like a society is a composite object composed of millions of people, potentially, which can have an effect upon the individual. You as an individual can be impacted by your society. So you, even though you're embedded in your society and your society is, you compose a part of what your society is, you as an individual can be influenced by your society. And that's rather obvious, right? Like the beliefs you have, the moral beliefs, the music you listen to, the way you dress, the food you eat, the language you speak. All of these are influenced by your society. So something at a higher level is influencing you at the lower level. Okay, but at the same time, you can influence your society. So there's both these upward effects and downward effects. It's both. And it's almost like circular. It's like you're embedded in this loop where you influence your society, but your society also influences you. Like the accent with which you speak your language, that's influenced by your society. But you can also kind of alter that. If you, for example, start to speak differently, other people around you might also start to speak differently. And so you can have this effect upon your society, but your society is also having an effect upon you. And then it keeps chaining down. So your society can influence you, and then you can influence your genes through epigenetic mechanisms. So you can actually influence the expression of your genes based on your behavior. For example, if you spend a lot of time in the sun and you do so deliberately, that will alter the structure of your DNA. And there are other examples of things which you can do at the individual level, or even things that are caused by your society that have an influence on your DNA. So it's not just that your DNA is causing everything to happen. DNA is itself being affected by things at the higher level, and this is the nature of reality. So if we originally thought that everything was just upwards causation and reductionism, that's been shown to be completely wrong. And this is a very simple example which demonstrates this. And hopefully you've found it convincing. And what I'm saying is that there are phenomena which are much simpler, but which have the same basic principle. So something that's composed of many parts can influence those individual parts. That's very clear in the case of a society influencing a person, but it might also be true in the case of a molecule influencing the atoms out of which it's made, or a molecule influencing the quarks and electrons out of which it's made. Those examples are less obvious, but they're basically the same thing. Now, the reason I have put Aristotle in the middle of this presentation is because this idea isn't actually a new idea. Aristotle discovered the idea of strong emergence a long time ago, which shows that Aristotle really was ahead of his time. Now, this is the way he put it was in terms of the four causes. Now, the four causes of Aristotle are the material cause, which is essentially what an object is made out of, the formal cause, which form that it takes, the efficient cause, so what in the past kind of led to that object taking the form that it does, and then the final cause. Now, the final cause is interesting because what it's basically saying, what it basically suggests is that an object has a purpose, and that it itself can become a new kind of cause for other things. And so the purpose of an object is what its final cause is. And the final cause is actually strongly related to the formal cause. So the form that the object takes will determine what its final cause is. Now that's interesting because what this is saying is that once an object, or once, for example, like a chair being made out of wood, once a chair is constructed out of wood, it in and of itself will kind of have new properties, or its behavior will be different because it has a certain form. So the form of a chair causes people to sit on it, in a sense, and that's what its purpose is. And so this holistic entity, which is composed of various parts of a tree, now will, let's say, have a different trajectory through space-time. That's a funny way to put it, but that's literally what's happening because of the way it's formed. So the holistic system will now behave differently. Now, Aristotle obviously put it differently than that, but this is all to say that Aristotle discovered the idea of strong emergence 2,500 years ago. And so it's not really a new idea. I guess it sounds like a new idea because reductionism has been kind of the mainstream idea in physics. And so the idea of strong emergence countering or being in opposition to reductionism makes it seem like strong emergence is a new concept. But really, it's existed for a very long time. And Aristotle was smart enough to realize this fact. As he was quite brilliant. Now, what we want to discuss now is whether we can prove a phenomenon is either weakly emergent or strongly emergent. There have been many cases of supposedly weakly emergent phenomenon being proven as such. And to prove that a phenomenon is weakly emergent is fairly simple. All you need to do is look at the math which governs the fundamental constituents, so the standard model Lagrangian as our example, and use that math to show that this new phenomenon follows from the math. And if the behavior of the phenomenon is entirely determined by the math of the fundamental constituents, you have a weakly emergent phenomenon. Now, I should make the note that weakly emergent phenomena can be weakly emergent with respect to different domains. So we talked about different domains of knowledge. In each of these domains, you can show that there are weakly emergent phenomena within these domains themselves. And so like within any system of math that tells you how things behave, how objects move, for example, like relativity tells you how planets move, or even like, F equals ma, Newton's laws of physics will tell you how objects move. So you can prove that phenomena are weakly emergent with respect to Einstein's laws. Sorry, not Einstein's laws, Newton's laws of physics. And so hopefully, I mean, that's kind of a complicated thing to explain, but hopefully that gets the idea across. Now, to show whether something is strongly emergent is really difficult because you could say, for example, that this is strongly emergent, but you don't know for sure because what if it's just that you haven't done the math properly or that you haven't fully accounted for all of the particle dynamics. And so not accounting for those, maybe that's why this phenomenon doesn't follow from the fundamental math. But you can actually prove that phenomenon is strongly emergent. And you can prove it definitively, such that it's impossible for it to be weakly emergent. And how you do this is you show that this new phenomenon has a downward causal effect upon its constituents. And what this implies is that it's impossible for you to use the fundamental physics to work your way upwards to that phenomenon because the fundamental physics themselves have been altered. So I should make a note actually that some philosophers or some scientists have argued that it actually makes more sense to posit that a phenomenon is strongly emergent and then attempt to falsify this. But at the same time, you can actually definitively prove that something is strongly emergent. Because I know people sometimes confuse strong emergence with like randomness or like unpredictability. It's not unpredictability per se. It's unpredictability just based on fundamental laws. If you knew what the higher level laws were, the system should be fully predictable, or in some cases it shouldn't be predictable. For example, with like random effects, for example, like the way DNA behaves. But in other phenomena, it should be fully predictable if you account for higher level laws, but the existence of higher level laws is itself proof of strong emergence. And so there's no way that system can be strongly emergent. So can we prove it? Yes, and we have. And we've done this at the level of fundamental physics, which is very stunning because it's pretty hard to imagine how you would prove that like a person is strongly emergent from fundamental physics because the calculations would just be astronomical. But if we look at a very simple system, for example, a system that we've invented and we fully understand, such as computer transistors, we can show that a computer transistor and the way it behaves is strongly emergent. Now, Computer transistors, which are enabling you to watch this video right now, are arranged in different ways to give you logical statements. Okay, and what you're doing when you arrange transistors in a certain way is you're forcing electricity to do logic, to engage in logic. Okay, and then whatever the electricity does is the answer to your logical question. So you can create logic gates, which are, for example, called and, nor, and, not, and or. These are like the fundamental ones. And then these logical statements will change how the electricity flows through them. And what this is showing is that logic is influencing the way that electrons behave. Okay, and this is an example of a top-down effect, which implies that it can't be predicted solely from lower-level laws. So if you wanted to understand the way electrons move in a transistor, you can't without accounting for logic. But what is logic? Logic is a kind of abstract thing which we impose upon the electrons. We're the ones who have designed these logical statements. And so the logic that we impose upon the electrons is causing it to move differently. So logic is an abstract thing which exists at a higher level, and yet it's causing electrons which exist at a lower level to behave differently. Okay? So the argument starts by looking at the different levels, and Ellis divides them neatly. So we have at the lowest level this Hamiltonian, which determines how electrons and ions behave. You can think of it as being similar to that Lagrangian, which I showed you earlier, but it basically just tells you the total energy of a system, which gives you information about the kinetic and potential energy of the electron as it moves. So you can do this. So this is the kind of equation that determines how each electron and each ion behaves. So you can think of it as like the lowest level. Okay. One level up, we have the general flow of electrons. So now we don't think of the electrons as like individual particles, but as like a whole collection of particles that moves in a kind of sea, and that's determined by the electric field around the electron. So electrons will move towards the positive end and away from the negative end. And so the electric field, you can think of it as like kind of a bigger thing influencing the way electrons move. Now, humans, through human ingenuity, have created these things called crystals. More specifically, have created these things called semiconductors. You may have heard of semiconductors being like really precious and very expensive. And the reason is because through our ingenuity, we've created a way to control the flow of electrons via semiconductors. So these semiconductors are made of silicon, and they're injected with different atoms of, I think, boron and phosphorus. Now, again, this is not a natural process. It's something that humans have designed. So we've created this new thing called a semiconductor, and it exists at a kind of bigger level because it's a molecular structure, whereas the electrons are individual particles. So the electrons are much smaller, whereas the crystal is much bigger, and the crystal is affecting the way the electrons behave. Okay. Now we created this thing called the transistor, which is basically just a switch. So using the principles of semiconductors, which I just explained, you can create a switch which turns on or off the flow of electricity. Okay? And this is a very consequential thing that we've invented. Like I said before, you watching this video is entirely dependent on these transistors. Basically on these electrical switches, which are super tiny, which can either allow or inhibit the flow of electricity through a circuit. It's a very simple principle. It's a very simple thing what's going on, even though it involves complicated physics. Now, you can take these transistors and arrange them in certain ways. For example, if you take two of these and arrange them in parallel, you have one of these AND gates. And if you arrange them in series, you get an AND gate. If you arrange them in parallel, you get an OR gate. And you can arrange them in a whole bunch of different ways and get these different logic gates. And so these are answers to logical statements, very basic logical statements. But you can make them out of transistors. And so you're doing logic with transistors. Now, I decided to go one level up. Ellis actually stops at level 5, but I like level 6 because you can combine the transistors. And again, it keeps showing that principle of emergence, how smaller things give rise to bigger things. But you can combine transistors to do digital logic. So you're not just answering questions and or not. You can answer very complicated questions with various arrangements of transistors. Excuse me. And this is rather profound. This is a rather profound consequence. We can force electrons to do math for us. Excuse me. So the behavior of electrons is being determined by the mathematical operations we impose upon those electrons. Now, the question we want to ask is, could I just use the electron equation at level 1 to determine what's going to happen to the electrons in these transistors at level 6? And the answer is no, because abstract logic, which we've created using the design of these logic gates, is influencing the electron dynamics. So the structure of these logical statements is determining how electrons move. Now, that's kind of crazy if you think about it. Logic, something that exists in a kind of abstract space, and again, it exists in an abstract space, but we represent it using these logic gates, is changing the way electrons behave. Now, what Ellis does is that he shows that if you want the equation at level 1 to work, you need to change it. You need to alter the equation to account for the complicated mechanisms which take place at the higher level, so like crystal structure and phonons. And again, the source of this alteration is the higher level, is the abstract logic. So if abstract logic exists at a higher level, it's influencing things happening at a lower level. So this is downward causation. So the logic itself, the abstract logic, is having an influence on the fundamental physics. And the conclusion that we're forced to come to is that the behavior of electrons in transistors, or rather transistors themselves, are strongly emergent. They have a downward causal influence on the fundamental constituents out of which they are made. And so there's no way to use pure physics to understand the behavior of transistors. And again, all of this appears to be taking place at level 4, at the transistor level, because it's at this level where the more complicated dynamics take place, which again are involving higher level phenomena than just electrons. And this is what's causing the electrons to either flow through this channel or not flow. So yeah, this demonstrates a very clear example of strong emergence, and one that we could calculate, that we could actually work out the math for, because it involves just transistors, i.e. something that we understand mechanistically very well. And so you can imagine something like a transistor, which again is fairly simple. I mean, relative to like the neurons in your brain, it's a very simple mechanism. So you can imagine that if something like this is strongly emergent, something like consciousness probably almost certainly is strongly emergent, right? And like even consciousness feels intuitively strongly emergent, but this is showing that it very likely is strongly emergent, because if this simple system is strongly emergent, something like your brain and other phenomena that take place in biology and physics, biology and chemistry and higher domains, these are very likely to be strongly emergent phenomena, or at least many of them are likely to be strongly emergent phenomena. And so that's quite convincing and quite amazing. Now, I want to touch on something called multiple realizability. I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'll give a more thorough explanation. But basically, this is the idea that it's possible to get the same strongly emergent phenomena with different arrangements. Okay, and this itself shows that a phenomenon must be strongly emergent, because it shows that whatever that phenomenon is, if it can be expressed in different ways other than fundamental physics, it means that the phenomenon itself must be something apart from physics, irreducible to physics. And so the example here, this is actually the same thing that we just saw. This is kind of like those transistors, but it's using water. So this is a computer that uses water instead of transistors. But it does the same thing. It does digital logic. You put inputs into these different water containers, and then the the design of these little boxes is made such that we can use them to do logic. So we create these little boxes, and then this changes the behavior of the water within and causes the water to do math for us. So we can do logic using water and using a clever arrangement of these orange boxes. But it's the same thing that happens in your computers. Your computers do exactly the same thing, except they use electrons instead of water. So if digital logic can be done using water or electrons, this shows that the digital logic has to be something different from just electrons moving through wires. Electrons moving through wires facilitates it, but the logic itself is something new, something brand new, because it can be expressed in different ways. It can be expressed in terms of water instead of electrons. And equivalent examples might be something like life. The life that we observe is all carbon-based, but it's possible that in the universe, something that's equivalent to life, that's basically life in all but form, exists, and it's composed of different molecules. And what this shows is that life has to be something which is not reducible to pure molecules, because it can be realized in different ways. Your consciousness, here's a good example. You and I can have the same thought. Let's have a thought, like for example, I am hungry. We both have that same thought, and yet the molecules that cause that to happen might be different. And so that shows that the thought itself must be something apart from the molecules. It must be something separate, because different arrangement of molecules can give rise to the same phenomenon. What was another example? DNA. I mentioned before how DNA and encoding information like that is something which has to be independent from the molecules which it's composed of. And that's very much the case, because you can get completely different molecules expressing the same DNA or expressing the same encoding, which shows that the coding itself must be this new phenomenon, which is irreducible to the physics. Now, in the case of computers, it's rather interesting because there are more emergent levels. We just stopped at digital logic, but computers are these incredibly fascinating objects which have multiple emergent levels built into them. Like I said before, we needed to invent a new branch of science to even understand these objects, which we invented. Higher and higher levels can be shown to have a downward causal effect upon the flow of electrons. And so at the highest level that we have in this diagram is code. So like the code that you write out on your computer in Python or C++ or Java, whatever language you use, that is a kind of abstract entity that you've created. And this abstraction, this code, which exists as a kind of language, a logical language, dependent upon the coding language that you use, that logical sequence of instructions that you yourself have created can chain all the way down through this series of levels. So it goes to compilers, and then assembly language, then machine code, and then the CPU architecture, the microarchitecture, the digital logic, and then the transistors. Your higher level code can influence the flow of electrons. Okay, so it's not the flow of electrons, and then through upward emergence, the flow of electrons will give you whatever result. So you write your code, you input it, you run it, and then it chains all the way down to affect transistors. So that's downward causation. But then the transistors then chain all the way back up to give you your output. So for example, if it's a video game, whatever happens in the video game will happen because of the transistors working at the bottom level. And then you as a programmer can then influence that again. So it's this chain that goes back and forth, up and down. And so it's linked together. The key thing being that it's possible for the higher level to affect the lower level, whereas in reductionism, it's only the lower level which can affect the higher level. But a computer is an example where that clearly cannot be the case, because you can show that the higher level that you invent or that you create using your code can influence the lower level. So computers are a very clear example of strong emergence and the fact that reductionism must be false. Now, I want to make a completely different argument. Because if you recall what I said before, I touched on it kind of briefly, that you can get strongly or weakly emergent phenomena within specific domains. So you don't have to start from fundamental physics. You can just you can start at kind of like any theory, any mathematical theory that tells you the behavior of something, and then you can try to show that something is strongly emergent or weakly emergent within this domain. Now, the domain that we're looking at here is something called Conway's game of life. If you don't know what this is, I recommend looking it up because it's a very amazing invention which George Conway created. He's a mathematician who passed away recently, but he's a legend in the field of mathematics, and he created this thing called the game of life. And it's still the subject of considerable research today. And we're still discovering new things about it. And what's amazing is that it's a very simple premise. The premise is that you have these squares. And in fact, let's look at an example. So you have these squares which are either alive or dead on a square grid. And this grid is infinite, so it goes off in any direction. And you can set up the initial conditions. Let's just do this. And then you start it, and then very simple rules will tell you what's going to happen in the next generation. It's something like, let me read the rules. A new cell is born if a dead cell had 3 living neighbors. Okay, so for example, let's say I think this cell right here, if you can see my mouse, will come to life in the next generation. Yeah, it did. Okay, so if a cell has 3 neighbors, it comes to life. What else? If otherwise the cell dies, and a cell will stay alive if it has 2 or 3 living neighbors. Okay, so very simple. These are extremely simple rules, and yet they can give rise to crazy kinds of behavior. So let's look at it. Take an example of one of these. I'll scroll down a little bit just to get one of the more interesting ones. Yeah, let's try this. Okay, so this is an arrangement here, and just watch how this behaves. So I just kind of increase the speed, but you can see it's kind of like bouncing back and forth between these 2 walls. Like it's going this way, then that way, then this way, then that way. So you can get these complicated behaviors, and there's a whole bunch. Let's look at another one just so you see what I'm talking about. So you have things that kind of like sustain themselves. Oh, that looks cool. Let's see what this does. Oh yeah, okay, so it's just like, moves, it like crawls across the thing. So this is an example of emergence because you start with these lower level laws and these just simple cells on a board, but then these cells interact in complicated ways to get you crazy behavior like of the sort that we just witnessed, of this thing moving across the screen. Okay, so now I told you the rules, right? The rules were fairly simple. Now the question is, are these rules sufficient for explaining everything that's going to happen in the game? Now, you can do this for weakly emergent phenomena within the game of life, but not for strongly emergent phenomena. And what's amazing is that several researchers have independently created strongly emergent phenomena inside the game of life. Now, what that means is that if you were to use the basic rules to predict what's going to happen, you would get the wrong result. The reason being is that these larger structures are having an influence on the smaller cells. Now that's completely perplexing and completely crazy because you would think that just from these very simple, rules, you should be able to predict anything that's going to happen. But that's not true at all. You can get phenomena within the game of life that are impossible to predict unless you can understand how this bigger structure is influencing the smaller structures. So this again proves that strong emergence exists. And you might be thinking like, well, this is a computer simulation. Maybe it doesn't apply to real life. Well, first of all, it's a computer simulation in real life. Secondly, it's a very, very simple system. The rules are really simple. Whereas the rules that influence particles are very complicated. The math is really complicated and involves quantum mechanics and huge numbers of particle interactions, and you have to, the calculations are enormous. And so it's hard to believe that this super simple system can give rise to strongly emergent phenomenon, but the particles of the standard model can't. Like, it's very likely that the particles of the standard model and the super complicated math, which deterministically tells them how to behave, can give rise to strongly emergent phenomena. So that's a completely different argument, which should hopefully convince people that there are strongly emergent phenomena, and that it's not that hard to believe that like a lot of such phenomena exist, including you as a human being, things like society, things like language. Language is a great example, but all of these phenomena exist in kind of different domains. And they must be irreducible to physics. Like, it's hard to understand language in terms of physics anyways. A lot of the things that we study in linguistics have nothing to do with language, have nothing to do with physics, because it occupies its own domain and it just has different rules and different laws apply to it. And again, these laws can be either upwards, causing new things to emerge, or downwards, having an effect upon the components out of which they are made. Or they can even just exist on their own domain. So like these higher domain phenomenons, they can have, effects which aren't upwards or downwards, but just kind of contained within their domain. So each field of knowledge exists at its own level and accords with its own laws at that level. And new such phenomena are coming into existence all the time. And we don't know where it ends. There could be a huge number of such phenomena. And in fact, there's reason to think that there's way more strongly emergent phenomena than weakly emergent phenomena, and that we're not going to see all of these phenomena because, in our universe, there's only a limited amount of time for such things to happen. But as the universe evolves, we don't know what kinds of phenomena are going to exist. And we can't predict them ahead of time. But once they start to exist, we can begin to understand them. But this is why the universe is just so ridiculously complex and why we need so many different fields of science in order to understand it all. And again, we don't know where this ends. We can keep building new strongly emergent phenomena that are completely different from any other phenomena that we know of in the universe. And again, this is kind of spooky. And it implies that the universe is just this. Actually, there's a line from the book Blood Meridian that I really like. That's something like the universe is bepopulate with chimeras. It's a fevered dream, a trance, no man's mind can compass it all. Because it's just so ridiculously complex, and new things will keep happening that we couldn't have predicted beforehand. It's quite a privilege to live in such a universe, because if everything was weakly emergent, we shouldn't expect very interesting things to happen. We shouldn't expect life to happen, for instance. But because of strong emergence, such things can happen. And it just makes the universe more fascinating and more beautiful, in my opinion. And again, as we progress technologically, we seem to be observing and creating phenomena that are like super strongly emergent. For example, the internet, which is emergent out of individual computers. And so it's one level higher than computers, and yet its behavior is so crazy and complicated and hard to even understand. The internet is such a complicated thing to be able to wrap our minds around. But then we have things like AI and large language models and like all the other things that are being produced by AI. These are all they all seem to be like super strongly emergent and just utterly perplexing. And we don't know where the limits are. And as we progress technologically, we seem to be creating more and more strongly emergent phenomena. And these phenomena will stretch our ability to understand them. Although we should be able to understand them if we embrace the fact that they're strongly emergent. Anyways, that's the end of my presentation. I do have a lot more to say. And again, I'm even talking about this. I've thought of other things I can bring up, but I think I'll leave it there and maybe dig into more specific topics about emergence in the future. But if you found that interesting, if you found that enlightening, please let me know. I do this all for you guys to learn and to feel more connected with the world around you and to feel a sense of profoundness for what you observe, because this is a very, very mind-blowing topic. And I hope you agree that it's very profound. Anyways, thanks for listening. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.